Our text for today is from Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9, that whole account of the flood narrative and Noah and the ark. But what I want to do first as we begin is I actually want to step back a couple of verses that I foolishly omitted when we put together this service, because these are ones that really we need to dig into and contend with and understand. We're going to go back to Genesis chapter 6, starting with verse 5, which says this. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created, from the face of the land. And then verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. The Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created, from the face of the land. Now, is there anything in what I just read that causes any distress within your heart? This idea of a divine judgment and the flood blotting out man from the face of the earth, is there anything in there that maybe makes you recoil just a little bit? Well, for many people, it's stories like this, the flood, which they say, this is the reason why I simply cannot believe the Bible and I can't believe in a God who would do that. I have a quote from a noted, he's a comedian, he's a political commentator, he's a well-known atheist, Bill Maher. You've heard of him. He said, the thing that's really disturbing about Noah isn't that it's silly, it's that it's immoral. It's about a psychotic mass murderer who gets away with it, and his name is God. There are several things there. I mean, first of all, he kind of alludes to the fact that the story of Noah is silly. You know, the idea of an ark and the animals 2 by 2, and we're familiar with maybe children's Bibles and kind of cartoons and stuffed animals, and it can kind of seem like a fable or a fairy story. I mean, the reality is almost every ancient civilization around the entire world has some form of the flood narrative, of a flood story. There's over 200 different accounts, myths, or narratives of the flood, and 70% of those also include an ark or a vessel of some sort saving humanity. How do we account for that? And to sort of dismiss it as something silly, I mean, it seems to give credence that there was some kind of massive, epic, mega flood event in human history. But more than that, he doesn't just say it's silly, of course. He says more than that, that it's what? Immoral. And again, Bill Maher is an atheist. And so to claim that something is immoral is to presume that there is something called morality, that there's some sort of moral standard by which we can judge things to be immoral. But if there is no God, and truly all there is the physical, material universe, nothing spiritual, nothing supernatural, there cannot be in any real sense a morality or an objective or an absolute in any way sort of right and wrong. We have personal individual preferences, or groups of people can have preferences, but there is no morality in any real sense. So he takes the very concept of a morality from God and uses it to judge God. He's taken the morality that comes from the Bible in order to judge and even reject the Bible. If you see. But still, Christians or non-Christians here, wherever you happen to be, when you hear this story of the flood and of divine judgment, is there something in you that is disturbed by that or distressed by that or concerned with that? I am. As I read this, it's okay to have questions and to wrestle and to think through these things. Maybe subconsciously, that's why I omitted this part from our reading this morning. I think one of the reasons, if you're a Christian here today, one of the reasons why Christians we believe the Bible, we believe in God, but we hear this story, we get a little uncomfortable. Maybe it's because we are so used to the idea of God's grace that we come to expect God is just gracious, God is merciful, God is love. And so we can take God's grace for granted. Well, God has to be merciful. God has to be gracious. Look, who receives grace in this story? Well, Noah and his family. It says Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Here in verse 8, he found favor. It kind of sounds like Moses was the good one and everyone else was bad. No, he was a sinner too. The root word in the Hebrew for favor is the word grace. That Noah received, and his family received grace from God. So Noah and his family received grace. Everyone else received what? They received justice. But no one received injustice. Do you see? Noah and his family received the grace of God. Everyone else received justice, holy and right justice. No one received an injustice from God. But let's go a little deeper than that. Because if you have a problem with divine judgment, and I understand that, if we have a problem with divine judgment or God having these divine and holy standards by which we are judged, if that's a problem, let me say there's an even greater problem than that we have to wrestle with. If we reject God's divine judgment and his divine standards, if we reject God himself, we have a much greater problem. Because what is the occasion and the reason for the flood? We see that in verse 11, where it says that the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And then verse 13, it repeats the same thing. He says the earth was filled with violence through them, human beings. The idea here is that human beings were already destroying themselves, and human beings were destroying God's good creation through this violence. But here's why I say there's an even bigger problem. If you do away with the idea of God's divine judgment, of a divine standard, therefore you get rid of the idea of the divine, of God, then you have no answer to the problem of human violence. Because if there's no God, and again, we all came out of nothing somehow, and we're atoms and molecules and just the physical, what is violence? Violence is a part of nature from that perspective. Violence is natural. We talk about the origin of the species. We talk about natural selection. We talk about survival of the fittest, where the strong survive, and what happens to the weak? They die off. It's violence. Violence, apart from the reality of God, if there is no God, violence is just a part of the natural world. And human beings, there's nothing special or sacred about us, made in God. There is no God. You're just another form of an animal creature. So, well, but violence is a violation of human dignity, human rights. What do you mean, human rights? Where does human rights come from? And I appreciate it when our atheist friends and neighbors are honest about this. This is a quote from an atheist writer, thinker, is Yuval Noah Harari. He's an Israeli atheist. He says, human rights are just like heaven and like God. It is just a fictional story that we've invented and spread around. Just as jellyfish and woodpeckers and ostriches have no rights, Homo sapiens have no rights. Take a human, cut them open, look inside, you'll find their blood, but you don't find there any rights. The only place you find rights is in the fictional stories that humans have invented and spread around. And he's right. If there's no God, we reject divine judgment and the divine, we reject God completely, and there's just the physical stuff of the universe. Human rights is just something we have invented to get along. But they're not real, they're not objective in any act, and that's why they shift and they change over time, depending on the people and the culture. And so I understand divine judgment, uneasy about that, God, but if there is no God, we have an even bigger problem. We have no answer to the violent world in which we live. And it was violent then, and sadly we know it's so violent now. But let's go even deeper than that. Because if you're distressed or disturbed in your spirit over this, there's one who's even more distressed and even more greatly disturbed. And we see that back up here in verse 6 of chapter 6. It says, the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Now, that's one of the most astonishing little statements in all of the Bible. That it grieved him. There was a deep anguish. There was an unfulfilled, painful longing within the very heart, the core of the existence of God. God is suffering over the sin and the darkness and the violence of humanity. The same Hebrew word that's translated here as grief that's used in another place in the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah chapter 54 verse 6, he's doing this comparison. He's speaking about a woman, a wife whose husband has left her, deserted her. It says, the Lord has called you like a wife deserted and grieved in spirit. So it's just describing this reality of what happens if you have a wife whose husband has left her and abandoned her and deserted her, and it's describing that grief. Some of you know that. It can be worse than death because it's an ongoing death. It's like an ongoing grief. And God has the audacity to speak of his own suffering, his own heart, with this same language. That his heart was grieved. It grieved him to his heart. It grieved him so greatly to the very core of his being as God, this deep anguish. Now, I mention that because along with this question of divine judgment that can concern us, I've been asked this question a lot over my 20 plus years as a pastor. Some of you maybe have asked this question, and it's this. If God knew that we were going to sin and all of this pain and suffering and terrible things, why did he create the world in the first place? You ever ask that question? Think that question? Or, why didn't it at least end it after Adam and Eve, right? They messed up. He could have just ended it. He could have ended the world, no more human history. Well, if he knew, why did he? And sort of implied in that is actually you're saying this. You're saying, I don't see any good reason why God would do that. Therefore, there must not be any good reason. That's a logical fallacy. It's called the argument from ignorance. Well, I don't see any good reason why God would do that, so therefore there must not be a good reason. That is a fallacy. But more than that, we ask that question, sometimes just as an intellectual question, but a lot of times we ask it because we see human trouble and suffering and maybe troubles in our own life. But I don't think anyone asks that question thinking about it from the perspective of God and what God has endured. God could have ended it with Adam and Eve. He said, no more humanity, no more world, no more history. And his suffering and grieving heart would have been over. But through all of human, it's not just this one time at the flood. I mean, after the flood, we all became perfect. No, even after the flood, one of the first things Noah does is get wildly intoxicated and does horrific things to his family. And the sin grows and the violence is here with us today. And throughout all of human history, God's heart has been breaking in grief. It's like this too. A parent or a grandparent, some of you know this pain. If you see your child or your grandchild and they're doing something that you know will ruin their life, it is some of the deepest grief and hurt. That's the heart of God throughout all of human history. So can I answer that question? If he knew, why did he create? I don't know if I can answer that question. But here's what I know, that there must be the most wonderful and beautiful and glorious and awe-inspiring answer to that question, because look at what God has endured, his own infinite grief throughout all of time and space and history. If you're distressed, God is way more. But let's go deeper. Let's go deeper still. Because here in the flood, we see what we call the pattern of salvation. The pattern of salvation. This isn't ultimate salvation. Of course, that's going to come many years later. But we see already the pattern of it. And by that I mean this, that salvation comes not despite suffering or judgment. Salvation comes not despite judgment. Salvation comes not sort of parallel or along with judgment. Salvation comes through judgment. Look at the story. Noah and his family, God comes to them graciously, tells them how to build the ark. They get in the ark, literally says God shuts them in, and then the judgment of those waters comes down, and Noah and his family is saved and lifted up. Salvation came through, do you see, the judgment. He said, but that's one family. Who was Noah? Why Noah? Remember Adam and Eve? And Adam and Eve, they had Cain and Abel, and that all went messed up. And so then God gave them another son named Seth. So Adam and Eve, they had their offspring, their son named Seth. By the way, I'm reading here in Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 comes right before, wait for it, Genesis chapter 6. Okay? Genesis chapter 6 is the whole story of the flood. Right before the flood, God has Genesis 5, and it's that part, if you read Genesis, some of you skip over. It's so-and-so begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, and all of that, the descendants. Adam and Eve, had Seth. Seth's offspring was Enosh. Enosh's offspring was Kenan. Kenan's offspring was Mahalalel. Some of you are going, he's going to read all the names, isn't he? Yes, I am. Mahalalel's offspring was Jared. Jared's offspring was Enoch. Enoch's offspring was Methuselah. Methuselah's offspring was Lamech. And Lamech's offspring, his son, was named Noah. Great, you're giving me his family lineage. Why? Because one page before this, in Genesis 3, evil, Satan, in the form of a serpent, is cursed. And remember it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He, that's speaking of Christ, he shall crush your head and you shall strike his heel. In other words, one is going to come who's going to crush and destroy sorrow and sadness and darkness and evil once and for all. And that's the promise which was then given, their offspring, that was given to Adam and Eve and to Seth and to Enosh and Kenan and Mahalalel and Jared and Enoch and Methuselah and Lamech, all the way to Noah. So that as the judgment of the flood comes and the salvation is occurring, it's not just saving this one family, it's God saving the world. And God saving his promise of the Messiah, of Christ, of Jesus himself. And this is a picture of the cross where God himself takes the judgment to bring you the salvation. There is a cost to sin, and God himself pays that price and bears the cost within himself. As we close here, let's go one more time even deeper. Because the very end of this account in chapter 9, the waters have subsided, the ark is there, it's dry land, they're out on the dry land, they're out of the ark. It says God makes a covenant with Noah, and indeed he makes a covenant with the earth. And he put what up into the sky? He put a rainbow as a sign of that promise. But it doesn't say rainbow. I think it was a rainbow, but that's not the language that's used. Chapter 9, verse 13, listen to this. God says, I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. I've set my bow, it's a sign of my covenant, of my promise. It didn't say rainbow, but it's talking about a rainbow, but it says bow. Now, what's the word here? The word bow is the word for bow and arrow. A bow and arrow that you might use to hunt and to kill, a bow and arrow you might use in war. Think about a rainbow. What's the curvature of a rainbow? God's bow in the sky. The curvature, where is that arrow pointed? It's not down to the earth. It's pointed upward into heaven, into God's own heart. Think of this. God, with a beautiful rainbow, literally puts his bow in the clouds to remind us that we do not receive the judgment. He is going to receive the judgment and the arrow into his own heart. Genesis chapter 6, God's grief, God's heart is breaking. On the cross, God's heart is broken. Like maybe literally. You remember the story of after Jesus died, they took a spear and they pierced his side, and outflowed what? Water and blood. All of this blood kind of gushing out, mixed with water. And scientists and doctors and medical people have tried, what could have caused this? And one of the ideas and one of the possibilities, and maybe a probability, is something called a cardiac rupture. That under extreme stress and extreme pressure and strain, the heart itself can rupture, can break open. That God, the Son of God, died from a broken heart. Physically, literally, but of course spiritually and cosmically. God says to you today, I know all of your doubts. I know all of your guilt and your shame. I know all the questions you have and maybe difficulties you have and you wrestle with my word. I know it. My heart was broken so that your heart can be healed. So I can reach down into the depths of your soul and give you a new heart and a new life where you don't have to run and you don't have to hide and you don't have to be afraid in my arms. My arms are open. Look at my grief, my sorrow, and come to me. My heart was broken that yours could be healed. To God alone be all the glory. Amen.